They want us to be complacent, they want us to just toe the line, and they want us to be submissive.
Within the media industry, there's been a complete schism.
But in Australia, it is probably more severe than almost anywhere in the world, except for perhaps Germany. There is a near blanket ban on referring to the genocide in Gaza as a genocide, on referring to Israel as an apartheid state.
You never would have expected this from The Guardian. The Israelis massacred, burnt people in their tents. There's a father holding up his headless child. It was all over the world. And then I checked The Guardian's website to see what they covered. And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. Everyone in the world can see a headless child, and your report is calling it a precision strike.
The trips that Australian politicians take to Israel, sponsored by the Israeli government, or the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, a guy named Bevan Shields. He has been on one of these trips. The editor of the Daily Telegraph, which is another major newspaper in Australia, a guy named Ben English. He has been on one of these trips. And you can say the same for most, if not all, of the major media organisations in Australia.
We're not a mouthpiece for governments. We wouldn't do that for the Australian government. Why would we do that for the Israeli government?
It's like a revolution in the global media landscape, with thousands of journalists all over the world resigning, being sacked, speaking out, signing petitions, setting up new platforms. And just by looking at the numbers of followers all these platforms are gaining and mainstream media is losing is proof that the people are with us. Welcome to episode 20 of series 2 of Real Talk. And today I'm very excited to introduce to you a couple of Australian guests who will be talking about one of the most important things happening in the world today, which is the suppression of the media and silencing our voices. It's a rising new platform in Australia called Deep Cut News that has evolved as a result of this ongoing global mainstream media hijacking by negative forces, powers, individuals and interests that are trying to subvert the truth and manipulate our minds. We'll meet Antoun Issa and Alex McKinnon, one based in Sydney and the other based in Melbourne, although one of our guests today is in the sunny tropics of Cairns in northern Australia. And we'll learn from them what compelled them to start Deep Cut News. We'll also discuss the ongoing oppression of journalists hit with lawsuits, being sacked and much more in order to silence them. And I'd like to announce today that just a few days ago, I joined the ranks of those being sued for speaking out for the truth, which I'll share more details on during this interview. So stay tuned. And to all our subscribers, followers and fans, we want to thank you very deeply for your interest in these important topics and discussions and your financial support that allows us to continue to deliver truly independent voices and issues directly to you. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And if you can spare the cost of a coffee once a month, please click on the link and buy me a coffee. I'd love an almond latte, please. So let's get into it by introducing our two guests today. The first is Antoun Issa. He's an independent journalist based in Melbourne who hails from Beirut, Lebanon, where he worked as a journalist mainly focusing on Syria and Gaza, and was the former news editor of Al Monitor, an independent online news platform based in Beirut. Antoun spent 3 years also in Washington, D.C., working for the US think tank Middle East Institute before joining The Atlantic as an editorial strategist. And in 2020, he returned to Australia and joined Guardian Australia, but resigned last year after their biased coverage of the Gaza genocide. And I believe you're currently writing a book as well, Antoun, and we'll get you to tell us all about that shortly. So welcome, Antoun. And our next guest is Alex McKinnon, a Sydney-based independent journalist who, as he puts it, is reporting what others won't about Australia's silence on Palestine. He was formerly the editor of Schwartz Media's The Briefing and a former editor of Junkie and The Star Observer. Alex has been published in Al Jazeera, The New York Times, The Observer, The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, Gawker, The Outline, Crikey and Overland. Since January 24, he has been reporting extensively on the relentless campaign of censorship, punishment and silence being waged against people in Australia who oppose Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip. In 2024, he was honoured to be named Crikey readers, as we say in Australian, shit stirrers of the year. There's an expression that is so Australian. I'll let people confer what they want from that, but definitely something we will explore with Alex in a minute. So welcome, Alex. Welcome, gentlemen. It is late afternoon in Australia, but 10 a.m. in Beirut. And I've just been back a couple of weeks, so it's my first podcast from Beirut, and very happy to have you join me from the other side of the world. So welcome, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us, Daizy.
Pleasure. What I'd like to do is start with a brief personal intro from you guys, just to tell us a personal history of your journey and why you are on the mission that you're on today. Antoun, if you'd like to start.
I think one of the highlights of my professional career was working in Beirut and being the news editor for Al Monitor and being responsible for Gaza and forming a team of really excellent Palestinian journalists in Gaza, from Gaza, who know it inside out, have all the contacts. And for the first time, I felt we were producing actual journalism from Gaza that was humanizing the Palestinian people, humanizing the Palestinians in Gaza, and producing it for the dual audience, because we would produce it in both Arabic as well as English. So it was a remarkable team. There's one that's still remaining there who's still reporting from the ground. It's the highlight of my career.
What years was that, Antoun? When did you do that?
2011 to 2014.
Wonderful. And you've still got a journalist on the ground there that survived this latest genocide.
Yeah, she's still there. She's still doing the work. She's writing at the moment for Dropsite News. So really courageous work.
Fantastic. Good on you. And Alex, tell us a bit about yourself and your journey to where you are today.
Nothing as distinguished as Antoun. As you mentioned in my intro, last year, at the end of last year, I was honoured to be nominated by readers of Crikey.com, which is an independent news media publication here in Australia. I was nominated by them as one of their choices for Crikey's 2024 Stirrers of the Year, which touched me deeply. It is the only journalism award that I have ever won, and probably the only one that I would ever want to win, apart from, the highest honour, which is being assassinated by the CIA.
So tell us about Shit Stirrer. Explain that to audiences around the world who have no idea.
Sure. For those who don't know, a shit stirrer in Australian is somebody who makes trouble. The greatest professional compliment I was ever paid came from a manager at a place where I used to work. And it wasn't made to me, it was said about me after I had left. And they described me as difficult to somebody else. They said that Alex was difficult. Well, one of the reasons was that I kept asking annoying questions about, why we were pulling articles down about things like, climate change that our advertisers didn't like, things like that. And so this person described me as difficult. The Crikey Award came after a year where I had been writing, as you mentioned, very extensively about the issue of Gaza in the Australian context. For those who don't know, you can probably guess if you live in the Western world and you are familiar with the media repression that's happening in other Western countries, but in Australia, it is probably more severe than almost anywhere in the world, except for perhaps Germany. There is an almost total, a near blanket ban on referring to the genocide in Gaza as a genocide, on referring to Israel as an apartheid state, despite the overwhelming evidence to back both those facts. And anyone who speaks in those terms, whether it's in politics, in the media, on social media, even in their private capacities, will find themselves a target, basically, for media smear campaigns, for political attacks, for threats on their employment, threats on their livelihood, threats of violence, instances of violence, and reporting on that consistently for the entirety of 2024 meant that a lot of people found me difficult. And so to be called a shit stirrer in that context was something that touched me very deeply.
Excellent, excellent. We should all be shit stirrers. That's what I say right now, with the way the world, the situations we're facing around the world. Yeah,
absolutely.
They want us to be complacent. They want us to just toe the line, and they want us to be submissive. And what we're talking about today, and what you guys have done with Deep Cut News, and what we see happening around the world, it's like a revolution in the global media landscape, with thousands of journalists all over the world resigning, being sacked, speaking out, signing petitions, setting up new platforms. Possibly the most famous one we know of is Mahdi Hassan's Zeteo. I'm sure we all know about that. But literally, there's been a plethora of new independent platforms emerged because of one thing: the undeniable, untenable propaganda and bias of the coverage on the Gaza genocide. Despite this frustration and irritation and annoyance and disbelief, honestly, it's a disbelief of everything that we've been brought up to believe in as journalists and even as human beings, that you got to follow the truth and follow the rules. They've all been thrown out the window, and we're all, the leaders. We've known that, major individuals, and Australia Murdoch, who I worked for 20 odd years, and those around the world who control the media, but also major corporations and political interests control the ideology, control the narrative that comes out to us. And so to see this revolution, and to see so many journalists like yourselves stepping out on a limb and putting everything on the line to be able to speak honestly, has been so encouraging. It gives me great hope. Because we just don't want to agree. We just do not agree, because they are working against the principles of our industry, and we are trying to safeguard the truth. It's happening, as you know, and as you've said, Australia, Britain, America, Germany, Lebanon, literally everywhere. And just by looking at the numbers of followers all these platforms are gaining and mainstream media is losing, is proof that the people are with us. So let's get into the discussion on Deep Cut News and how you guys decided that you were going to set this up together, and how you guys met. What was that process? How did you meet? How did you feel like, yes, we can work together? Antoun, if you'd want to start.
I think I just hit up Alex when I was in Sydney, being like, hey, I follow your work. We're good to catch up. And so we did. And then I discovered that actually Alex had already set up his life to do this. So he had already kind of restructured his own circumstances. So to kind of do a weekly newsletter, and he was putting out his own weekly newsletter and dedicating time per week to do so. And I'm like, I want to do that. I'm like, why don't we just do it together? Because we both want to cover the same thing in this pressing time, in this pressing moment. And so it was just more of a coming together of, I guess, two journos here who were on the same path, on the same mission, came together several times and brainstormed and had a few working sessions. And next thing you know, we have a Substack and we're churning out stories and we're getting tips coming our way, which is wonderful because, it's good to see it. We've gotten a bit of a response since we've launched. But as you're saying, it comes in this context. So it's not really a surprise, right? It comes in this context of, growing frustration within the media landscape, within the media industry, that I don't think many people get to see. Like within newsrooms, there's a lot of tension. Outside of newsrooms, there's a lot of tension. Like within the media industry, there's been a complete schism between, I guess, media editors, media bosses that are firmly with the establishment way of looking at the region, which is a very colonial mindset, which is a very racist mindset, and they're not aware of it. And then you have journalists and reporters who, don't live in the mansions that their bosses live in, and often are renting and are much more in tune with what's going on the ground, on the street, in communities. And I think as a result of that, you're also seeing a lot of those reporters being like, okay, can we just do our work and properly on Israel and Palestine, on the Middle East, apply the same journalistic principles that we would apply to every issue to this one? And often you found that there were constant roadblocks put in place by those media bosses who live in the mansions. And in that context, this emerged. And so it's just something that needed to happen, happened. And that's how Deep Cut came about.
Alex, anything else to add on that?
Yeah. So before February, I think, of this year, Antoun and I had never met. We, I think, knew of each other professionally. And out of the blue, he messaged me and said, "Hey, let's meet up. I want to run some ideas by you." And from there, we both clicked really quickly, and we agreed that not only that there was a need and to be filled and an audience to be reached, but that the way to reach that audience, fill that need, meant that we both had to do things a little bit differently. This kind of work, at least in the initial stages, it doesn't pay. You have to work very hard for very little money. You have to build your profile. You have to build your audience. You have to cut out all the kinds of institutional pressures that mean that journalism like this doesn't get done at large mainstream publications, which means no corporate backing, no institutional backing, relying purely on the readers, which is a big ask. You know, Australia has been going through a cost of living crisis, it feels like 4 or 5 years now, if not longer. There is not a lot of money that people have to throw around. And so going to people and saying, "Hey, can you stump up, $12 a month or however much it is to support journalism," is a big ask. And in order to get people to do that, you have to really work for it. You have to be uncompromising with your vision. You have to be uncompromising with the truth, and you have to deliver the kind of journalism that other places won't do. So that's the job we've set for ourselves. It's very stressful to do if you're looking at your bank balance day to day, which I've trained myself out of doing. But it's also very important work. And you have to trust that the audience respects that and recognises that there is a real need for this.
Definitely. And I commend you both. I'm totally on board with everything you're saying. And I'm similarly in that situation where you've just got to rely on people, but and the goodness of people. And this is a very important point. You mentioned no institutional support, no, structural corporate support. One thing I want to ask you is to clarify 100% where your funding comes from, because this is a real attack. This is a way that they attack us and make us look like we are being funded by, dark forces, really. And so I wanted to ask you that question. Have you received any funding from George Soros or any other foundations? That apparently the whole world is being funded by George Soros at the moment. Every independent...
George, man, if you're out there and you've got money burning a hole in your pocket, let's talk. I got a mortgage, man.
Yeah.
So no, we haven't been receiving any funding from anyone who's wealthy. I don't know, I haven't gone through our subscriber list to work out if anyone is wealthy or not. If they are, I'll give more. But no, it's entirely funded so far from the readers, right? So it's a Substack, which means, to get funding, you need to get people to pay for your services. And we're offering our journalism for free as well. I know, other platforms that have launched, like Zioni, have put some of their content behind the paid wall. We've decided not to do that to start off with, because our personal thinking is that journalism, and especially the journalism that we're doing, serves a public interest, a really urgent public interest. And also conscious of the cost of living crisis. We know that, people might not be able to afford to get informed, right? But they should still get informed. Being informed isn't a privilege. Everyone should be informed. So we are relying on people just to, recognize and value the work that we do. And it's still early days. We're literally only in our second week. But this is the long game. We are playing, it is stressful, but I think we're hoping that, as we continue to, churn out really good, hard-hitting journalism that is really not happening in Australia at all, that people will start to recognize that and will value that and will, support us going forward. But it's a gamble. It's an absolutely a gamble, 100%.
Absolutely. And yeah, as long as you can get past the year, I think it takes, at least 12 months. It's like setting up a new business. You have to give yourself runway in order for you to get recognized and acknowledged and respected, and then it will spread. So I just think, if you can stand the test of the initial period of time, because the work you are doing, I've checked out your Substack, it looks great. The stories are very interesting. Well, you've got a lot of followers already. Like, I mean, you're over 3,000 or something on some of your platforms.
4,000 now. Yeah, 4,000 subscribers. I'm amazed. I thought we were going to get a few hundred for the first 2 weeks, and we've got 4,000. So, but that just shows you the appetite, Daizy. I mean, as you were saying before, and one reason why, because I worked in audiences for a long time. So at The Guardian, I was, working in audience growth. At The Atlantic, I was working in the US, I was working in audience growth. So I've been in the audience game in mainstream media for a very long time. And one of the reasons why I decided to pursue this with Alex was because I could see that there was an audience that was growing, especially around Palestine content since the genocide began, and not insignificant. And I didn't think it was insignificant enough not to launch an independent outlet and thinking that this community might be able to sustain something. I mean, it's a smaller market in Australia because we're a smaller population, but the community here that's been built around the genocide is the same community that's been built in the US, in the UK, and other places. And it needs a media that caters for it, and that's what we're trying to do.
Alex, any comment?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about partnering with Antoun and starting up was that he has, a wealth of experience and knowledge about growing audiences, which is something that I severely lack. Like Antoun said, I was kind of churning out my own newsletter for a little more than a year. I started it in January 2024. It was almost exclusively focused on, the Gaza genocide in an Australian context. And that the growth of that experience and the interest that received convinced me that this was a viable something that could become something bigger. That grew to about, I think, 3,000 subscribers in a little over a year, despite my own lack of basic graphic design, promotional, anything. I was pushing it out through my own social media channels.
Well, let me ask you this question. I wanted to dive in, Antoun, into the reason you left The Guardian. You touched on a few issues before about the issues inside newsrooms, but I wanted to get much more from you. And also, Alex, if you've had that experience, what's happening inside newsrooms in Australia? I worked for, as I said, News Corp, News Limited for probably 17 years, worked at the Australian newspaper mostly. I started in sports and went to foreign affairs and worked on the foreign desk. And it was a different era, though. We're talking about the 90s, late 80s, 90s. I ended up being deputy foreign editor on the Australian and worked later on as features editor. I felt at the time that just looking at the coverage of Lebanon and Palestine, because I really got into those issues back in those days, that definitely back then not enough coverage was being given. But what I found was that being on the desk and having that power as a deputy foreign editor and having to pitch to my editor-in-chief in the morning conference and pitch the stories, in the newsroom, I was able to convince them, because I had knowledge, because I'd worked in London, I'd been in the Middle East by then, and I had a lot more context to actually publish stories about Lebanon or what was going on in the Middle East, because I could sell it to them effectively. And one of my former editors-in-chief said to me he'd never seen as many stories on Lebanon in the Australian ever in his history. And I said, have any been invalid or inappropriate? And he said, absolutely not. It's just, what you're talking about. So there's this two sides, but obviously there was also the influence of the Zionist lobby back then too. And every year the editor-in-chief and foreign editor or news editor or someone would be taken off on their junkets to Israel, along with politicians and that. I'm sure, and if you can validate it from both of you, from the different organisations you've worked with, do you see that still happening? Are they still taking people over on junkets, the Israelis, to convince them that, to brainwash them into their point of view, but also, and then I want to bring it back to today and last year and how that, manifested in the newsrooms or in your places of work, where you saw the editorial position come down and you had to watch journalists implement something they didn't believe in. So I want to get into that. What happened and what is happening? Because it's a case study for what's happening in all newsrooms around the world.
I haven't really spoken openly before about what happened, at least in a media context, what happened at The Guardian while I was there. And a lot happened. A lot happened on the inside. It got really tense, very difficult for a lot of people. And I'm talking internationally. It wasn't just in Australia. All the three bureaus, the main bureaus, which are London, Australia, and the US. I also did video content at The Guardian here in Australia. I was fronting my own videos. I was producing them. I was anchoring them. And then after October 7, I was taken off videos. And
without reason?
The reason they gave was that they were short-staffed and they didn't have people to help produce my content. So that was the reason that was conveniently given around the same time that a genocide was unfolding. So I'm like, okay, sure.
They obviously earmarked you as a problem, and they wanted to make that problem before it.
And then I would pitch columns, and my reasoning was, I am the most experienced person, at least in the Australian newsroom, but I would argue even in the US, in the UK newsroom, on everything that happens in the Middle East. I had worked at the think tank, Middle East Institute. I'm technically an expert because I was a non-resident fellow at that institute for a long time. I have researched and analysed and worked on the ground in the region. I have contacts throughout the region. There's no one else at Guardian Australia, at the very least, who has that in-depth knowledge. And yet my columns, my ideas kept continuously got rejected. Like, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't. Oh, and then on top of that, I wrote a daily newsletter called The Afternoon Update, which is a news roundup of everything that happens in the world. And of course, as everything was escalating in Gaza, that was top news, as you would remember, for at least 2-3 months, every day. And every day, bitter, really tough arguments with editors in Sydney who were insisting on adding Israeli government, summaries or versions or narratives of what was happening on the ground without verification. And it really reached a breaking point around that initial attack on the Al-Shifa hospital, if you would remember. I think it was in November 2023. It was their first attack on the hospital, and everyone was like, oh, what a big deal that was. And of course, fast forward to now, and they've destroyed nearly every single hospital. So my job was to relay the most recent update to our audience, and then would get a new update in the morning once we knew what would happen. You're in the confines. You have to massage your language, right? Because you're working in mainstream Western media, which is already laden with its own inherent biases. Yeah. And I know they're not going to give the Palestinians the time of day. And I remember writing a lead that was very benign. And I said, my strategy to get through this is just to be benign, because if I push the buttons, it's going to be daily stress for me. And it was already amounting to daily stress because I was already having daily arguments about the wording. And I just wrote something along the lines of, Israeli forces are stationed outside of Al-Shifa hospital. That's it. Kept it very benign. It's factual. That's what's happening on the ground. The Guardian's reporting from the foreign desk in the UK is telling us that is on the ground. I'm not adding anything more to that. The editors in Sydney, all three white British men, were insisting that I include the Israeli government's reasons for why they're at Al-Shifa hospital. And the reason was because there was a Hamas command center, the Hamas command center. And I absolutely refused. And I said, I am not putting anything that we have not verified. We're not a mouthpiece for governments. We wouldn't do that for the Australian government. Why would we do that for the Israeli government? We have no way of verifying whether there is actually a Hamas command center on the ground. It is a war crime to attack a hospital. And I do not want to put my name to something that masks over a potential war crime that's about to take place any minute now. The deputy editor at the time of Guardian Australia, and he just bulldozed me out the way and just wrote it in himself, but still published it under my name. And then There were grievances in the UK, within the newsroom there. There were grievances in the US. There were complaints coming from all around, especially amongst Muslim staff, Arab staff. It was just getting very difficult because these battles were happening daily. There was one instance, Daizy, where Israel had attacked South Lebanon, and I was getting very angry at the fact that we were not sending any resources to Lebanon in those first few months. Okay, you can't get into Gaza, but you can send someone to Lebanon and even send them to South Lebanon and document what's going on down there. And they had a journalist they sent from the UK, another white old British man. They keep sending all these white old British men when they have a whole staff. That's another problem. They kept sending white British men to the region to cover it. And they did this puff piece from northern Israel on the border villages. That completely, and it was that puff piece that we all know has been done a million times to death. Oh, how these settlers are under constant rocket attack. Hezbollah's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you have the resources to do the exact same story on the other side of the border and speak to Lebanese in those border villages who are getting bombed daily, but you're choosing not to do that. And I'm like, people got killed in Lebanon. Are you going to include that in the blog? They ended up, and I'm like, it's even in the national news agency. And I sent them the links. Here's the link, the English version. It's a state newswire. So it's not affiliated with any political organization. Can you write it? The whole operation was just, it was so problematic. And then we got to a head. So if you remember, towards the end of 2023, there was an open letter that came out of the US that was signed by about 600 US journalists. And it resulted in the chaos at LA Times, if you recall. That open letter was pioneered and started by Guardian US journalists who were getting fed up with the coverage. That prompted us, a few of us in Australia, to do a similar newsletter. I wrote the initial draft. And there were journalists from across the landscape, ABC, the 9 newspapers, various Crikey, various outlets. We all kind of got together and went through various iterations and drafts, and we published them. We got over 300 mainstream media journalists to sign that open letter. You never would have expected this from The Guardian. The Guardian that advertises and continues to plaster on its website and in emails asking for donations that it's a progressive news outlet, that, it's fighting the billionaires and it's all about holding the powerful to account. They were the fiercest in their crackdown on journalists within the newsroom. We were banned, and the ban came from London, US, and Australia. All 3 editors of the 3 offices sent a newsroom-wide all over the world to every Guardian journalist, banning us all from signing open letters going forward. And we have a tradition of signing open letters to The Guardian, and that prompted another response because the unions of each and the guilds of each newsroom, US, UK, and Australia, combined to reject it outright and said, we're just going to oppose this. We're not going to follow this at all. And it's been frozen ever since. But then the coverage never changed. It remained the same. The Israeli narrative at the top, Israeli narrative in the headlines. It's as if we were like, there was the press release for the Israeli government. At one point, I was just like, why do we even have a live blog? Let's just default to the Israeli Foreign Ministry's Twitter account and let them just tell us what's happening from their side, from their eyes and their version of events. I was burnt out. Journalists of color were really burnt out in Australia in particular, and many of them left. It got to a head for me in the Rafah massacre, I think in May 2024, when we all saw it was streaming. I was in Europe at the time, right? So it was happening as I was there. And within minutes of it occurring, millions around the world could see on our Instagrams, on our TikToks, decapitated babies. The Israelis massacred, burned people in their tents. There's a father holding up his headless child. It was all over the world. And then I checked the Guardian's website to see what they covered. The Israeli government's narrative that they were attacking they called it a precision strike. Targeting, a Hamas militant or something. And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. Everyone in the world can see a headless child, and your report is calling it a precision strike. So I just got to a point where I'm just like, I don't want to be here anymore. and I don't want to do this anymore. So I resigned.
What a great story. And I'm sure that played out hundreds of times around the world, as you mentioned, with newsrooms around the world, but not only The Guardian, but the BBC. I know I read so many reports of different organizations where journalists are just needing trauma treatment and stress treatment because they're having to, work and live and work in circumstances that they morally don't agree with. So it's affecting them psychologically. I'm going to quickly go to Alex to give us any experience you had before we dive into the next theme. So tell us, Alex, what experiences you had last year during this whole entire period with the Gaza genocide?
The story that actually springs to mind for me goes back a little further. For about 2 years, I worked for a news outlet here, or a news company here called Schwartz Media, which has a bevy of print and digital publications, like the Saturday Paper, which is a weekly print newspaper, the Monthly, which is a kind of high-end monthly magazine, and a few others, and which sort of launched in the early 2000s and built itself, and still builds itself as, a left-leaning suite of publications, very progressive, very concerned about democracy and transparency and standing up to powerful interests and all the rest of it, And I got a job there, I think at the end of 2016. I was fairly junior. I was putting out their daily kind of morning email roundup, like a morning email newsletter. And I also wrote for them quite extensively on a freelance basis. And the sort of dirty little secret about Schwartz Media, which was the worst kept secret in Australian media then, and is no longer a poorly kept secret, was that while, the editorial line of publications was, quite progressive on most issues, but also, with a real emphasis on facts and on fact checking and being impartial, that did not apply to the issue of Palestine or of Israel. The phrase that was bandied about around Schwartz Media was progressive except Palestine, PEP.
Really?
I knew that in a vague sense at the time when I took the job. I was quite early on in my career, and I justified it to myself by thinking, I'm a young writer. This is a really good career opportunity. It's a way for me to publish good work. It's a way for me to get my name out there. And so I took the job anyway. And, if I'm honest with myself and with the people watching this, I did it because, I liked the idea of becoming a little bit more established, a little bit more important, I suppose. And so I put my reservations about Schwartz Media's coverage of Israel and Palestine to one side. I would occasionally try and raise it in a kind of half-hearted fashion with other people who worked there, who often had the same reservations, the same doubts. We would talk about it, I remember, in very diplomatic ways, because no one was ever quite sure how somebody else thought or felt about the whole thing. And so you would cage your language and you would almost speak in code to try and figure out if you were speaking to somebody who could be trusted, or if you were speaking to somebody who believed in, the editorial line as it was set and might snitch on you. I worked there for maybe 2.5 years, left in 2019 for unrelated reasons on good terms. And then in 2021, I think it was, Israel was bombing Gaza again. And I was looking at their coverage or lack of coverage. At the time, they published absolutely nothing from what I remember. And I kind of went, okay, I'd better late than never. So I wrote them an email and I said, look, I have a lot of, I sent it to the editor of the Saturday Paper, and I said, look, I have an enormous amount of respect for you personally and professionally. I have an enormous amount of respect for what the Saturday Paper's mission is, for the journalism that it produces, and I don't think you can deny that there is an unspoken editorial policy at this place which is not to talk about Palestine, not to talk about Israel. And you're doing a disservice to your readers and to yourself if you're not at least upfront about that. And your readers have a right to know that this is something that the outlet does. And I got the form email back. Thank you for your email, kind of thing. And I kind of went, okay. And that was really the first time I had thought about this sort of stuff in a serious way. I mean, before then, I had a very, superficial working knowledge of what every newspaper calls the conflict in the Middle East. And if anybody asked me about it, I would deflect to the usual, it's complicated, or all the nuances, X, Y, Z, just because I didn't know what I was talking about, or I was afraid that I would say the wrong thing. And, having sort of met more people from the region since then, having, read more widely on the issue, and having read actual, books on the subject as opposed to articles, which is something that I think most, especially most Australian journalists who write on the topic, can't say. And also having seen the ferocity and the barbarity of what Israel has done since October 2023, having learned about the history of the Nakba, about the more than 100 years of work that went into the occupation, and seeing the totality of how Australia's media institutions fell into line with the Israeli narrative was shocking to me, but it was not surprising to me. You mentioned earlier the trips that Australian politicians take to Israel, sponsored by the Israeli government or their domestic backers. There's the Zionist lobby groups. The editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, a guy named Bevan Shields, he has been on one of these trips. The editor of the Daily Telegraph, which is another major newspaper in Australia, a guy named Ben English, he has been on one of these trips. And you can say the same for most, if not all, of the major media organisations in Australia. The public broadcasters, ABC and SBS, are two exceptions in that they don't allow employees to go on these kinds of trips. But Australian media is a very small pond, which means that people who work at the Australian, for instance, or who work at the Sydney Morning Herald or the Guardian, sooner or later, if they are a career journalist, will probably work at the ABC at some point.
Exactly.
And there are numerous people in senior editorial positions at the ABC who have been on these trips, and SBS. And
they position them. They effectively, it's like a game of chess. They'll eventually get to those positions at SBS or ABC, because they can't use the official channels, but they actually position them there. They track them in that direction.
It's an enormously effective tactic, the free trip to Israel, right? Which is why Israel does it. They don't spend tens of millions of dollars on these trips because they're so excited to meet a bunch of journalists from Australia. It's the same reason they take Australian trade union officials. This is something that has been reported almost nowhere, that dozens and dozens of officials in major Australian trade unions go on these trips, so-called student leaders, who are politically active students at some of Australia's largest universities, who often go on to become staffers and politicians themselves. They go on these trips, and there are industries where these trips happen that I probably don't even know about, to be honest with you. The pervasiveness of it is eye-watering.
If we look at the industries that are supporting Israel and the institutions, even academic, corporate, financial, the weapons industries, across the board, not only in Australia, but around the world, it's obvious that this is, as you mentioned, it's been 100-year plan, if not longer, for them to get the world into a state and put people in positions of power across industry in order for them to commit this atrocity now. It's like October 7, they could have stopped it they had the means, they didn't want to stop it because they needed an excuse. They needed a catalyst for them to finally annihilate the Palestinians in Gaza. And they had their people in different institutions around the world. And they had lobbied, and the political leaders, you know, the story they gave of the 40 beheaded babies really was this flash and this match that just went wild around the world and made the whole world completely move to the side of Israel with that bullshit piece of propaganda that was never verified and has been completely debunked. But to your point, yes, it's like it's been orchestrated perfectly, positioning people around the world in multiple layers of industry and business. Yeah. Let's go on. I mean, I want to ask you, so you've been actually involved and interested in the topic. Obviously, I can understand why Antoun is, but I wanted your interest in Palestine stemmed back like nearly 9-10 years. When you first were saying you were at Schwartz Media, so you had a knowledge of it. You understood it was wrong. I mean, every 4 years or so, Israel would go in and mow the grass, or as they say, and you'd have this flare up of atrocities in Gaza. But nothing like we've seen now. But it's interesting to know why you were interested in Palestine, or the issues in the Middle East and the conflict in the Middle East.
It became something of interest to me in an Australian context because it seemed to be a good litmus test for how serious a person's commitment to journalism or to justice or to accountability or truth-telling was. Because it is probably the issue where you see the conflict between people's personal morals and their career interests, their financial interests, their institutional interests. You see where these things come into conflict, and you see what wins out. The issue of Palestine in particular is treated as so loaded in Australia and elsewhere, at least in part because,
as Machiavelli said, the end justifies the means. It's irrelevant that you can, to kill 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people, because the end for Israel and for America and those that want what they want, the means is irrelevant. They don't care how many lives they kill, how many people they kill. They don't care what they destroy, because their objective is much more important, and it's materialistic. It's not moralistic.
I think Joe Biden said back in the 1990s, if the state of Israel did not exist, the United States would have to create the state of Israel to serve its own interests in the Middle East. In an Australian context, I think what has really fascinated me over the last 18 or so months is the repression that happens, the firing, the threatening, the silencing, all that kind of stuff, is the grunt work of it is not done, I don't think, by people who are deeply ideologically committed to Zionism. There are relatively small groups that are committed Zionist groups that will email editors, that will get in contact with politicians or business leaders or what have you. But their influence is only dictated by the response. And the response comes from the people who run those organisations, who run institutions like Creative Australia, which has now a disgraceful track record of shutting down artists who have expressed opposition to the genocide. The Australian government, including ministers who have in previous iterations expressed a great deal of sympathy and support for the Palestinian people, and who now are the ones personally cracking down on expressions of Palestinian solidarity at home. In the media landscape and in non-profits and kind of more progressive spaces as well, the extent to which the memo has gone out to professional LinkedIn types, I suppose, people who are terrified of being yelled at in an email, or not being invited to the next writing session, not being invited to the next think tank, the next convention, whatever it is. That is terrifying.
More important to them.
So they are the ones who do the grunt work of emailing people, of cracking down and saying, you can't speak about this, calling people into their offices and quietly, inventing reasons to let people go. They're the ones doing most of the work.
How cheap are they? How cheap are they to sell their soul and sell their morals and ethics to a, it's about power. It's the same with the politicians. They're selling their soul to be able to attend the next junket or conference or speak at the next event, but it's happening in every industry. And I want to move on, but just to talk about something you brought up, which is leading into the oppression and talking about the justice system, to silence our voices, the legal oppression. But before we jump into the specifics, I wanted to formally announce what happened to me and where we are today. So in Lebanon and the court case that's just arisen. So about a month ago, we launched a podcast we'd recorded in Beirut about 6 weeks ago with a panel of independent media groups here. So I brought them together. There was 4 different organizations, and they're considered the alternative or independent media, not backed by any major, groups in Lebanon, which 99% of the media here is backed by political or financial interests. So, and there had been a big wave of attacks against them in February, March, leading into the announcement or selection of the new governor general for the central bank. As you know, of the corruption, the banking crisis. We don't need to go into all of that, but there was this attack on them because they were speaking out against certain candidates who they believed were linked to the old, establishment, the corrupt system here. Or they were doing their job, actually. They were analysing the field and presenting the criticism of certain candidates. Anyway, mainstream media here attacked them, and so I brought them in. I said, hey, let's have a chat about this. Why is there this uproar against you? What are you doing? Who do you represent? What have you been? And they're extremely well respected, spoke independently, as in they spoke very impartially. They spoke as journalists should. And in the conversation, I brought up the name of Antoun Issa. So this is probably going to cause me more problems, but I don't care. Antoun Issa, I've heard his name forever. I actually tried to get him to support when I was making my documentary, Enough Lebanon's Darkest Hour, which was released in 2022, talking about the corruption in Lebanon. Anyway, and I asked the question, so who is this guy? His name keeps coming up, blah, blah, blah. So they went around the table and they gave me their opinion on who he is or what they know about him, not personal, the factual stuff. Anyway, move forward 6 weeks later, and we get a notification that all of those on the panel, including myself and another friend of mine who runs Thawra TV, which is an independent social media platform, we've all been joined in a lawsuit by this gentleman, Antoun Issa, who's a major banker here, very big supporter of the, old governor and the system, because, there's certain people that have profited immensely from the crisis. And so this is where I'm at today. Well, I don't know what I've done, but I'm trying to do my job. That's all I know. The accusations are, as I mentioned, apparently that I'm being funded by foreign governments or foreign interests, and that we all are. And this is the influence, and we're trying to put out propaganda, whatever. So that would be, as you guys know, it would be wonderful to be supported financially. And lucky for me, I'm a stickler for detail. And so everything is documented from my bank accounts in Australia, from my, to Lebanon, everything is paid for. There's a way to trace everything. I'm a bit of a stickler for ensuring my credibility right back from the 90s when I made my first documentary. But this is where I'm at today. And, I wanted to ask you guys, you have been threatened by anyone? Have you gotten to that stage for the work that you're doing? And if not, how do you feel about it if it does happen?
No, not threats, but I mean, and I hope we don't get any, but I'm assuming, Australia's got as you would know, one of the strictest defamation laws in the Western world, it's pretty much censorship. It's not defamation. It's so strict and so rigid that it's essentially used as a tool by the wealthy, those who have deep pockets that can flood you with legal costs, to essentially deter people and deter journalists from holding the powerful to account. So as a result of that, we have to walk a very careful line. And that was a big shock for me because I worked in US media for a long time. And in the US, you can get away with a lot of things that you can't get away with in Australia. And so for the first few months, I was very tense at The Guardian because, the lawyers there would always be like, Antoun, you can't say that. I'm like, what do you mean? Of course we can. And it's like, no, in Australia, it's pretty much like Egypt. You say that thing and you're in prison. So, so because of that, we have to walk a very careful line, and we've just started, and I'm anticipating getting, threats and headaches, particularly because we're going after the powerful, right? We're going after the ones with deep pockets. So I'm hoping we can try and avoid that through the diligence of our, the words that we use. We have to be very careful. Like the other day, for example, we published a story on an alleged Jetstar employee who traveled to Israel on a staff discount from the airline and boasted about it on her social media. We had to take comments off on our socials because in Australia, if someone puts a comment, makes a defamatory comment on your social media post, you're liable. That's what the courts here say. That's how ridiculous the defamation laws here are. It's the equivalent of censorship. So, and often you'll find Australian media organisations often turn comments off on a lot of their posts for that reason. Public don't know this, but it's because it's to protect organisations from being sued, because comments are treated. You're liable as the account holder for comments that other people make on your posts. This is just absurd. It doesn't make it a friendly environment for media or for journalism. It's getting worse. Whistleblowers are being criminalized. Free speech protections, particularly for journalists, are kind of dwindling. And it's a really difficult climate to work in, but we have to do the work that we have to do, because if no one's going to challenge it, nothing's going to change for the better.
Do you think it's getting worse, or do you feel like, obviously they wrote the laws and this is the way it happens, right? They get into power and they rewrite the laws so they can keep squeezing our freedoms, limiting our not only journalists, I'm talking about people, Australian, American, everyone. They put people into power, they get into power, they seem like they're great when they're getting in with these idealistic platforms and policies, but I don't know what it is. And I was going to ask you, like, behind the scenes, Schwartz Media, for instance, who owns Schwartz Media? Who owns The Guardian? Who is at the helm now? Is it controlled by institutions? I'm not sure about Schwartz Media, but when you look at, and I'm sure you've seen them posted on in the last year, the organizations that are controlled, that have Zionists in control, at the helm of them, and at the top of them are companies like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, who are the major financiers, obviously, but they bought into these companies and own a major stake in them. And I just wonder, because you'd have to have a lot of people around the world who are of the same mentality, obviously all, the belief system or anti-justice, anti-humanitarian law, anti-international law, to be allowing that widespread mainstream dispersion of information that is false. So I'm just...
But I think you're speaking to, what's becoming more and more transparent since the genocide began, which is the revolving doors between major political parties, governments, big corporations, big media, big institutions. It's a small club of very privileged people who go in and out in between those doors, right? And it's happening in all Western democracies. And I think, and so this is the local context of what's coming out of the Gaza genocide. The Gaza genocide isn't just, tens of thousands, potentially up to 200,000 people being slaughtered, and 2 million plus being starved, which is the top line, has to always be the top line. But it's also morphing into domestic political context. And domestic political context is that the democracy that we thought was a democracy isn't really a democracy. It's a bunch of privileged people who are going in between all these corridors of power, and those corridors of power, involve venture capitalists, involve big corporations, involve wealthy families, involve political parties and donors and mining companies and so forth, and media companies. They're all in fishing around in the same bowl. And we're seeing the ramifications of that, because there is no electoral gain for Australian politicians and Australian governments, either state or federal, to be supporting Israel. Peter Dutton, weeks before the federal election here in May, was saying that he would welcome Benjamin Netanyahu into Australia, and his politicians were badgering the Labor government about whether they would or wouldn't. Yeah. Benjamin Netanyahu is a wanted ICC war criminal. So they were using that as an attack line during an election campaign, being like, oh, we're going to disregard the ICC arrest warrant. We're going to welcome Benjamin Netanyahu in. Guess what? Peter Dutton lost the election in a landslide and lost his seat. And not only that, the Liberals, his political party, got a swing against them in the heart of the Zionist camp, which is the seat of Wentworth in Sydney. They had a swing against them. It didn't even win them votes among the Zionists. So, I mean, there is no electoral gain by supporting Israel the way they're supporting Israel. It's got nothing to do with that. It's the fact that they, politics here is so deep in, I'm just going to say it out loud, it's corrupt. The revolving doors between the major political parties and donors of all sorts. And it's not just limited to Israel-Palestine. I mean, you look at fossil fuels, for example. I mean, the Albanese government just announced the Northwest Shelf gas deal, which is a huge commitment to gas, despite all the evidence and all the talk about we're going to do net zero and bring our emissions down, la, la, la. It's across nearly every issue. On gambling, they won't ban gambling ads because they're getting donations from gambling companies. Fossil fuel companies keep backing both parties, and as a result, they keep getting gas deals and inaction on climate. The Zionist lobby, very deep in connections with both parties. That's why they're not taking action on Israel. Property developers, that's why we're not getting action on housing. It's across the board. The corruption is, and people are now waking up to this. It's like, it's not just on one issue, but it's on every issue. There is not a government that is making... Right, it is...
in DC.
Right, it's democracy for the lobbyists. Yeah. It's democracy for the lobbyists. That's what it is.
My question to you then, why aren't the good guys on the other side of the equation as good as lobbying as the bad guys? I mean, I'm saying bad because they're doing things that are not ethical. They're forcing issues. I mean, they think they're doing good, but they're not working for the environment. They're not working for issues that the people want. So where are the good guys? Alex?
I mean, the good guys are scrambling money and, try as you might to work from those strictures, practically impossible to achieve real change, which is why, I mean, and this is, our own experiences in microcosm. We, Antoun and I both worked for very well-respected mainstream media publications, and both probably thought, if I can get inside the system and I can change it from the inside, and I can affect that change, hopefully. But what we're learning more and more is that you don't change those systems change you. There are so many people who probably went into politics or the media or whatever it is with the best of intentions, thinking, I'm going to change the system. I recognize that this system is broken, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, and I'm going to get in there and fix it. And 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, they're enforcing the same injustices and inequalities that they got into the business to try and overturn. It's an incredibly effective mechanism for making good people do bad things.
And that's a really good point. And I think it's also applicable to, media and journalism, right? Like, I thought and I think a lot of my colleagues, The Guardian, thought that we were the good guys. We were in this progressive organization. They were very bold on climate and human rights, and they talk the talk on diversity. And then when it came to the punch, and when they were tested, and the Gaza genocide has been that test, they failed. They failed. And so it became apparent. I think, Alex is saying, I've been in the media for 15 plus years, and I had the same mindset. I'd work in the system, I'll speak the language that, they want to speak, and I'd go to DC and I'll try and work my way inside that system and see what I can do. And then I realized after a while, it was changing me. I became more restricted. I was working at the, I was working on Middle Eastern affairs in Washington, D.C., and I found myself self-censoring more than I ever have, because I had to work within the paradigm of how the US viewed the Middle East. I could only talk about my own native region and my own native homeland in the context of what was in the US interest. And I'm like, I don't really care about what America's interest is in my region. I care about what our interests are. Who's talking about that? And so that permeates across all Western, especially in the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere deal with the Middle East through the prism of what US or UK or French interests are in that region, right? It's a very colonial way of looking at the Middle East. And they apply that lens to actually all global affairs. You look at the discourse around China, they only talk about global affairs from the lens of what's in US Western interest. It's a very colonial approach. And I said that to my bosses when I left The Guardian, because we got into this debate about objectivity. It's like, oh, Antoun, you've got to maintain objectivity by being distant from the issue. And if you're too close to the issue because you're an Arab, you're not going to have that objectivity that's required. I'm like, you are talking as if you are the one who's objective, but you are the one who is applying a colonial perspective on the region. That's why your reporting is constantly biased, because you just can't humanize the subjects that have been colonized, right? And you keep looking at the region through the lens of what's in US and British interests, not from an objective lens of being like, you know what, the people there have agency, respect that, and they don't do that. So I think that's really important that Alex was saying that, I, as an 11-teen Arab, I found myself over many years becoming more and more restricted and confined and working in those spaces to the point where I was like, I was talking like them, and I don't want to talk like them. And in a way, even though we've taken a huge look, I'm going to be honest, it's a huge financial hit and a gamble to go on your own, not have that security of a regular paycheck, and so forth, and have the profile that you get from a mainstream media outlet. But at the same time, I'm like, for the first time, I feel liberated. I can finally talk about my own ancestral land as an Indigenous person from that area, without talking with this US interest overlay that I need to kind of factor in every time. Like, no, like that's not how I want to talk about this region.
Because you're an Arab or a Lebanese or whatever, that you are biased is so disrespectful of your industry, of your responsibility, of your profession.
Yeah.
You are a professional.
Right.
We have a lot of, as we've discussed, there's independent journalists here who are being attacked for doing exactly the same thing on the Lebanese soil and on issues in relation to Lebanon. But first and foremost, you've been hired to do a job, both of you, all of us. We're a journalist. We're not trying to come in and express our personal interests. We've got to maintain impartiality to be recognized as credible journalists. So they've removed that quality and qualification completely when they're saying you're an Arab, you've got no distance, you're passionate. Hey guys, that's just out of the question. But before we go, I want to just on this point, okay, we're looking at the Western world, we're looking at Western media, we're looking at Western institutions, leaders, white old men, the classic leaders, the patriarchy. But where are the Arabs in all of this? Where are the Lebanese leaders? Where are the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis? And, to their point, and I when I look back at this and I listen to those questions, because when I was doing my documentary, and I've been in the media, God bless me, nearly 40 years now, I look at, and I've talked to a lot of journos, The Economist and that, discussing the region. And I look at our image, the region's image. We have a lot of respectable people here, but in all honesty, our own region does not stand up for itself and does not have credibility in having institutions and credible, uncorruptible institutions, strong media organizations. You look at Al Jazeera, and that is great. I think they are very credible and they do things exceptionally well. But when you look at country by country, like the claim that the Americans, Australians, British, French, Germans, that they have independent media, although they're decimating, public media in all of the countries, even around the world. I'm a member of the Public Media Alliance. But I still say, obviously the Arabs here have done a horrible job, a terrible job in defending the Palestinians. One thing I've been taught in my training and personal development is, control what you can control, what's within your power to control. Because if you're trying to control others, you're going to become a basket case. So if the Arabs look at what they can control, and that is the power that they have over Israel, America, and the colonialists everywhere, with the oil, the gold, the money invested in bonds and institutions around the world, the legitimacy of opening up land tracts for Israel's, Ben Gurion Canal or whatever they want to call it, all of that, they have so much possibility of influencing policies of Western governments.
First, I would say that colonization of the Arab world isn't just limited to Palestine. The whole region's been colonized.
Yes.
And I wouldn't look to the current crop of Arab leaders around the region and think they are any way reflective or representative of Arab self-determination, because they're not. All the Gulf Arab leaders, those wealthy ones who have enough money to really transform the entire region and the entire Arab and Islamic world, and I'm not. All those families owe their power and prestige first to the British. The British helped them all get into power over 100 years ago. And the British helped them build their power bases. The discovery of oil happened, which filled their coffers. And the Americans have just taken over that British management, right? So the Americans haven't changed anything. They just inherited those relationships and those alliances. So the UAE, a lot of talk's been happening about the UAE because, it's ironic they're called the United Arab Emirates, because I think they're actually the anti-Arab Emirates. They've done everything against Arab interests in the region. They not only owe their kind of rule and their power first to the British and now the Americans, but they see their fortunes tied to Western imperialism. If you have made your power in the Arab world because of Western imperialism, because of Western intervention, why would you turn against it? It's working for you. And if you look at the history, and I'm talking about the history post the state of Israel. So at the beginning, you had Egypt under Nasser, you had Syria, you had Iraq, you had Libya, you had all these countries, the republics that were emerging as they were dictatorships, let's be honest, but they were emerging with this foreign policy of trying to be non-aligned. Like, we're not with the Soviets, we're not with the Americans, we are Arabs, we have our own place in the region, in the world. And I'm minimizing this a lot, I get it, but let's just minimize it for the sake of time, right? The Saudis were opposed to Nasser as vehemently as they're opposed to Iran today, right? The Saudis have always opposed the forces that have opposed the United States in the region, and Israel as an attachment to that, right? At first it was Egypt. Okay, Nasser is gone, they pacified Egypt and put a pro-US dictator called Hosni Mubarak in there, replaced him with Sisi, right? So that's Egypt's been neutralized. Egypt was the biggest threat to Israel, and Egypt's gone, right? They destroyed Iraq, the next biggest threat, right? They destroyed Libya. They've destroyed Syria. They've destroyed every Arab force that has emerged and that has tried to compete and contest American hegemony in the region. And the Gulf Arab families have always been on the side of Western imperialism because they got to power as a result of that. They're not going to let that go, right? And who's left? It's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And again, Iran has horrible human rights abuses. I'm not giving a green light to any of these regimes, right? Because they have done a lot of mistakes, and we could do a whole podcast episode about that. Yeah. But the position of the Gulf Arab regimes has always been to compete against powers that are emerging in the Arab Islamic world that seek to evict Western imperialism. Because without that American umbrella that keeps these Gulf regimes in power, do you think they're going to stay? Do you think they're going to remain in power? You think they're going to remain at the heads of the Arab world? So I think it's very important that we keep history in mind always, because history does inform present day actions, right? Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they're not the leaders of the Arab world. They are only concerned with their own power, and the threat to their power mostly always comes from within the Arab world, right? You got to remember who crushed the first Saudi state. It was the Ottomans, but it wasn't the Ottomans, it was the Egyptians. The Egyptians invaded and destroyed the first Saudi state. Those memories live on even centuries later, right? The Saudis and the Emiratis are much more fearful of the threats coming from the Arab Islamic world than they are from Israel. Israel and America protects them.
Yeah.
It keeps them in power, right? And that's why we have these horrific, horrible, we have we have an absence of Arab leadership and vision.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the Levant today, the new leaders in Syria and Lebanon, I wish my people would find some pride and see some strength within themselves instead of shopping around and running from this capital to that capital. Be my ally, give me some money, give me some weapons. Look at the strength within your own people. Ahmed al-Shara is running around trying to get people to validate his leadership. And the same with Joseph Aoun. They're all running around trying to get security and stability in their governments right now. The entire Levant is under attack every day. It's not just Palestine. They are colonizing Palestine. They are bombing Lebanon and Syria. Wouldn't it make sense that all of Bilad Hashem comes together and come up with a security alliance or a security kind of mindset amongst themselves? Why aren't the Syrians and Lebanese working together? They've got a common enemy right now.
They're still trying to stabilize the situation, the security inside Lebanon. But I agree with you that more has to be discussed. But I think the highest head of state that went to Syria was the Druze leader, Walid Jumblat.
Yeah.
But that is a topic for another discussion, Antoun, a big discussion. Before we wrap up, Alex, I wanted to just give you the floor to you if there's any other comments you'd like to make before we close out this fascinating discussion.
The only contemporary example that springs to mind as to why Arab leaders are so woeful in their response to the genocide and to the issue of Palestinian self-determination more broadly. The example that comes to mind for me is that of Morocco. Morocco, I think during the first Donald Trump administration, reached a deal with Donald Trump where the government of Morocco would recognize Israel, which it has now done, in exchange for the United States recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. Morocco's own colonial project, where it has committed, atrocious human rights abuses, where it is carrying out a slow motion genocide, where it has displaced the indigenous people who are almost entirely friendless and without support around the world. And the United States and Donald Trump, and he was quite clever to do it, honestly, said, and nobody recognized Morocco's claim on Western Sahara for decades. And Donald Trump said, you know what? He probably doesn't even know where Western Sahara is. He couldn't care less whether the United States recognizes it or not. So he said, yeah, we'll recognize that, but you have to recognize Israel. And the King of Morocco said, okay. And it's purely transactional, purely based on shoring up one's own power, one's own influence, one's own financial status.
No, that's a very good point, Alex. You're absolutely right. And the deals that they're doing, the contracts that the weapons contracts that they're negotiating and agreeing with Morocco and Israel are extremely disappointing. To see that happening. There are certain nations that are completely, I don't know how to describe it. They're just, it's irrelevant that atrocities and human rights and genocides and ethnic cleansing and war crimes are being committed. They don't even factor into their decision making. And then you see countries like Spain really taking the lead on a global level, by cancelling contracts, rejecting deals. I hope that, they will come out soon and recognise the Palestinian state. I'm not going to commend Macron. He keeps talking about a lot of stuff and saying it would be a moral injustice if the Palestinian state wasn't recognised, but he hasn't done it. He's trying to make up ground. And I think, all in all, and correct me if I'm wrong, world opinion is definitely shifting against Israel. Definitely.
Totally. Yeah.
we've
All the
seen,
polls show it. Yeah.
yeah, and even governments, and with our own government in Australia, but with England and France and Canada and I think Germany recently saying that, you know, they condemned Israel's blockade of the Palestinians and the food aid, and they were going to look at imposing sanctions. So it's the first time they've used the word sanctions. I mean, it's too late, but we need to move much faster. And
Totally.
you know, it's, I don't know, I think because we're watching it every single day, it feels like it's a you know, nightmare that keeps repeating. It's Groundhog Day. You know, we've got to get this stopped. I just don't understand the conscience of some people who can sit here and watch it every single day and allow it to continue. And yesterday we had the United States veto again at the United Nations Security Council another resolution, you know, to stop the ceasefire resolution.
But not that it matters, because like the Israelis aren't obviously not paying attention to international law. The Americans don't care about international law. They just impose more sanctions today on more ICC judges.
That's right.
So it's the unraveling of the rules-based order that the Americans in the Western world built. They're unraveling their own world order for Israel, for a tiny little colony. And I'll just make this, I want to stress this point because this doesn't get spoken about. I've spoken about a lot about Arab, kind of the Arab context. But if Australia tomorrow decided to sanction Israel, expel the ambassador, cut ties, I'm telling you, it's not going to make a single difference to Australia. Australia doesn't need Israel as a friend or an ally. It doesn't need Israel at all. And I would say none of the Western world need Israel. It doesn't bring them anything besides headache, right? All this. And so I think that point really needs to get emphasized. Like, we are willing to give up our democratic freedoms to bring this circle back to at the start of this conversation. We are willing to jeopardize our own democratic freedoms for a settler colony that makes absolutely no difference to how this country functions or the security of Australia. It makes no difference, right? If Australia cut Israel off tomorrow, Australia will be fine, right? We don't need to keep supporting this, you know, apartheid state, this apartheid settler colony that is committing genocide. There is no reason. It's not in Australia's interest to do so. It's got nothing to do with Australia.
They might argue the contract for the F-35 that spread all over the world to give everyone a piece of this contract. I think, I'm not sure how much it's worth, a couple of billion or something to Australia, but I mean, that's in the whole scheme of our economy, that's not a huge amount of money to lose, and we could pick up another contract. But I agree with you. I think that's a very good point, Antoun. I'm glad you raised it. Alex, final words.
Settler colonies stick together in the same way that, you know, billionaires have incredible class solidarity. Australia is a settler colony. Aotearoa, New Zealand is a settler colony. Canada is a settler colony. The United States is the biggest settler colony of all. If you undermine the credibility or question the existence of one settler colony, what's to stop you from doing it for the others? So I disagree with Antoun a little bit. I do think Australia has some interest in maintaining the veneer of Israel's legitimacy. The difference between Israel and Australia is not that great. It's one of degree, not of kind. You know, the genocide against Indigenous people in Australia has been ongoing now for about 250 years. And Australia is much more settled, I suppose, in that the settler colony is probably more embedded than that in Israel, in that the Israeli one is, you know, much more overtly challenged. But settler colonies stick together.
Love that.
Well, in terms of identity and in terms of, I guess, our sense of self, of course, you know, Australia and Israel have a bit of proximity. But I guess to clarify what I was saying in terms of, I guess, material interests, like economically and security-wise, I don't think being attached to Israel or disconnecting from Israel would have a huge impact on us materially.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen. That was a great discussion. Time went flying, but it was so engaging and I really appreciate it. I wish you tremendous success. We'll stay in touch. I'll reach out to you about Deep Cut News and everything that you're doing. But keep us informed. I have had a look at it. I looked at your Substack and I loved some of the articles on there, which it's great because I can go to them and find an alternate source of information for myself when I'm looking up issues. So really appreciate it. And I encourage everyone to go to Deep Cut News, subscribe, help these guys out. Honestly, you look at young family, independent guys doing it themselves to tell you the truth, to give you more information so you can actually decide for yourself what's really going on. And I think we need to get behind more and more people, because that's the only way that we as human beings are going to be able to survive into the future. And when I was talking about before, like this revolution, is it going to be good for humanity? I pray that it is, because the more people like yourselves go out there and many around the world do what you're doing, we will be in a much better place for our younger generations to be able to make better decisions for themselves. So thanks, guys, and thanks for finishing off season 2 with me. And I'll hope to see you when I'm in Australia later this year, and stay in touch, definitely.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk and experiencing firsthand the real stories told by real people. I hope you found value and meaning, and encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Your ongoing financial support is vital to our ability to continue delivering these stories, so please remember to click on the donate button in the description, giving only what you can afford. I spent my whole life giving my time, money and skill to serve human rights and social justice causes, and I know it's not easy to keep giving selflessly. But this work is important because the mainstream media has failed to live up to their obligations. So we need to step up, speak up, or we're no better than them. I believe by tuning in to this podcast, you are someone who wants to know the facts and the truth, so you can independently decide what to believe and what not to. My job is to deliver that information. Yours is to place a value on it. Whatever you decide is humbly welcome. Thanks again, and see you on the next episode of Real Talk.